The Cold War is usually remembered as a strange contradiction in history. Two superpowers stood armed with weapons capable of destroying the planet, yet they never fought each other directly. No formal declarations of war, no massive battles between American and Soviet armies, no clear beginning or end marked by gunfire. Official narratives describe it as a long period of tension, diplomacy, and ideological rivalry. Dangerous, yes, but ultimately restrained. And yet, during these same decades, millions of people died in conflicts linked directly to Cold War rivalries. Governments were overthrown, wars were funded from afar, and entire regions became testing grounds for power. If this was a Cold War, why was the 20th century one of the bloodiest in history? Why did nuclear weapons nearly get used more than once? And who actually paid the price for this so-called restraint? In this video, we're going to examine this story in detail and uncover what history usually leaves out. The term Cold War suggests a conflict defined more by threat than action, by tension rather than violence. It implies frozen hostility, a standoff where weapons remained holstered and diplomacy, however strained, kept catastrophe at bay. This framing largely emerged from Western political discourse in the late 1940s, particularly through the writings of American policymakers and intellectuals who sought to distinguish this new global struggle from the catastrophic world wars that preceded it. But even from the beginning, the reality on the ground told a different story. While Washington and Moscow avoided direct military confrontation, violence was not absent, it was displaced. The origins of the Cold War lie in the aftermath of World War II, when the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the two dominant global powers. Official explanations often emphasize ideological incompatibility, capitalism versus communism, democracy versus authoritarianism. Speeches by figures like Winston Churchill, particularly his 1946 Iron Curtain address, framed the world as divided into opposing camps. Yet behind this ideological language were more practical concerns. The Soviet Union had lost an estimated 27 million people during the war and was determined to prevent future invasions by securing friendly governments along its borders. The United States, meanwhile, emerged economically strengthened and thought to preserve open markets, political influence, and a global order favorable to its interests. This raises an important question. Was the Cold War primarily an ideological struggle, or was ideology a convenient language for deeper strategic and economic competition? Some historians argue that ideological rhetoric often masked traditional great power behavior. Diplomatic cables from the late 1940s reveal that American officials were deeply concerned not just about communism as an idea, but about Soviet influence over industrial regions, trade routes, and strategic resources. Similarly, Soviet internal documents suggest that fear of encirclement and renewed invasion shaped Moscow's policies as much as any desire to spread Marxist revolution. The first major test of this uneasy peace came not in Europe, but in Asia. The Korean War, which began in 1950, is often described as a proxy conflict, a limited war fought on behalf of larger powers. But for the millions of Koreans caught in the middle, it was anything but limited. The United States led a United Nations coalition supporting South Korea, while China intervened on behalf of the North with Soviet logistical and material support. Over 3 years, the war killed an estimated 3 million people, most of them civilians. Cities were flattened, families divided permanently, and the Korean peninsula was left scarred both physically and psychologically. Official narratives describe Korea as an unfortunate but necessary effort to contain communism. Yet declassified U.S. Air Force reports show that bombing campaigns destroyed a vast majority of North Korea's infrastructure, including dams and agricultural systems. Soviet and Chinese sources, meanwhile, framed the conflict as resistance against foreign aggression. The war ended not with peace, but with an armistice, leaving the peninsula divided and technically still at war. This outcome alone complicates the idea of a cold conflict. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, similar patterns repeated across the globe. In Iran, Guatemala, and later Chile, governments were destabilized or overthrown with covert or overt support from Cold War powers. American officials justified these actions as necessary to prevent communist expansion, often citing intelligence assessments and security doctrines like the domino theory. Soviet involvement in Eastern Europe followed a parallel logic, with interventions in Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968 framed as defensive measures to preserve stability within the socialist bloc. Some historians argue that these interventions were less about ideology and more about control. Diplomatic correspondence from both sides suggests that maintaining spheres of influence was paramount. The language of freedom or socialism provided moral justification, but the underlying goal was often geopolitical dominance. This raises another uncomfortable question. If the Cold War was cold only for the superpowers, what was it for the countries where these struggles played out violently? Nuclear weapons further complicate the narrative. The absence of direct war between the United States and the Soviet Union is often attributed to nuclear deterrence, the idea that mutual assured destruction made direct conflict irrational. There is some truth to this. Records from the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 show leaders on both sides acutely aware of how close they came to catastrophe. Private letters, taped conversations, and later memoirs revealed genuine fear, confusion, and miscalculation. At several moments, nuclear war was avoided not by systems or doctrines, but by individual decisions made under extreme pressure. Yet nuclear deterrence did not make the world safer in a universal sense. Instead, it arguably shifted violence elsewhere. While Washington and Moscow hesitated to fight each other, they continued to arm allies, fund insurgencies, and support wars in Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East. From Vietnam to Angola, from Afghanistan to Central America, conflicts escalated with foreign weapons, advisors, and funding. Civil wars became internationalized, and local grievances amplified by global rivalry. The Vietnam War is perhaps the clearest example. Official U.S. explanations framed it as a defensive effort to stop communist expansion in Southeast Asia. But internal Pentagon documents, later revealed in the Pentagon Papers, show that American leaders privately doubted the war's chances of success while continuing to escalate involvement for reasons of credibility and prestige. For Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, the war was devastating. Bombing campaigns, chemical defoliants, and prolonged fighting left millions dead and societies destabilized for generations. From the Soviet perspective, similar logic applied in places like Afghanistan. The 1979 invasion was officially justified as assistance to a friendly government, but Soviet archives suggest deep concern about losing influence in a strategically sensitive region. The resulting war lasted a decade, killed over 1 million Afghans, and contributed to the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union itself. Again, the violence was intense, the suffering immense, and the war anything but cold. What becomes clear when examining these cases together is that the Cold War's coldness was highly selective. It applied primarily to the relationship between the two superpowers, not to the world at large. The avoidance of direct confrontation came at the cost of indirect wars, covert operations, and prolonged instability elsewhere. This pattern challenges the comforting idea that restraint and rationality dominated the era. Instead, it suggests a system where violence was managed, outsourced, and geographically displaced. As we move deeper into this story, an important theme begins to emerge. The Cold War was not defined solely by what did not happen, a nuclear exchange between superpowers, but by what did happen across vast regions of the world. Understanding this requires looking beyond summit meetings and missile counts and toward the lived experiences of those who found themselves on the front lines of a global struggle they did not choose. As the Cold War matured, the pattern established in its early years became more entrenched. Direct confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union remained unthinkable, yet confrontation itself never disappeared. Instead, it evolved into a system of indirect pressure, psychological warfare, covert operations, and carefully calibrated violence. Intelligence agencies, military advisors, economic leverage, and propaganda became the primary tools of conflict. Official explanations often described this as restraint, but restraint for whom is a question worth examining. For much of the world, especially newly decolonized nations, the Cold War arrived not as an abstract ideological rivalry, but as a daily reality of instability, coups, and civil war. One of the least discussed aspects of the Cold War is the scale of covert intervention. Declassified CIA and KGB records reveal that both sides routinely interfered in the internal affairs of other states, often without public knowledge at the time. Elections were manipulated, political movements funded or undermined, and leaders quietly removed if they were deemed unreliable. In Iran in 1953, a democratically elected prime minister was overthrown with foreign assistance after attempting to nationalize oil resources. In Guatemala a year later, a similar pattern unfolded. Official rhetoric framed these actions as defensive measures against ideological spread, but internal documents suggest concerns over economic interests, access to resources, and strategic positioning played an equally significant role. The Soviet Union followed comparable practices within its own sphere. Eastern Europe, often described as liberated after World War II, quickly became a region of enforced political conformity. When local governments attempted to chart independent paths, the response was swift. Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968 are frequently remembered as moments when the Cold War briefly turned hot in Europe. Tanks rolled through city streets, protests were crushed, and thousands were killed or imprisoned. Soviet leadership justified these interventions as necessary to maintain stability and prevent external manipulation, but for those living under occupation, the violence was immediate and undeniable. This raises an important contradiction. The Cold War is often portrayed as a period of peace in Europe, especially when contrasted with world wars. Yet peace was maintained through force, surveillance, and the constant threat of intervention. Borders were sealed, populations monitored, and dissent criminalized. The absence of open war masked a landscape shaped by fear and control. The Berlin Wall, perhaps the most iconic symbol of the Cold War, was not simply a political boundary, but a physical manifestation of how far states were willing to go to preserve ideological and strategic dominance. Beyond Europe, the Cold War intersected with the process of decolonization, often with destabilizing consequences. Newly independent nations in Africa and Asia found themselves pressured to align with one bloc or the other. Aid, weapons, and political support came with expectations. In many cases, internal conflicts that might have remained localized were transformed into prolonged wars due to external involvement. Angola, for example, became a battleground for competing Cold War interests, with Cuban troops, Soviet advisors, and American-backed forces all playing roles. The war lasted decades and devastated the country long after global attention faded. Latin America experienced its own version of this struggle. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, military regimes rose to power with varying degrees of foreign support, often justified as bulwarks against communism. Argentina, Brazil, and Chile saw widespread repression, enforced disappearances, and state-sponsored violence. Declassified U.S. documents show that policymakers were aware of these abuses, but often considered them an acceptable cost in the broader struggle for influence. The Cold War in this context was not cold at all. It was brutal, personal, and deeply traumatic for millions. The arms race further complicates the narrative of restraint. While nuclear weapons were never used in combat after 1945, their development, testing, and deployment had real-world consequences. Atmospheric nuclear tests exposed civilian populations to radiation, particularly in the Pacific and parts of Central Asia. Entire communities were displaced, and long-term health effects were often ignored or downplayed. Internal government studies later revealed that officials were aware of these risks, but proceeded regardless, prioritizing strategic advantage over human cost. At the same time, conventional arms production reached unprecedented levels. Both superpowers and their allies produced vast quantities of weapons, many of which were exported to conflict zones around the world. Small arms, artillery, and aircraft flowed into regions already struggling with political instability. Once introduced, these weapons rarely disappeared, continuing to fuel violence long after Cold War priorities shifted. The global arms trade, accelerated by superpower rivalry, left a legacy that persists to this day. Psychological warfare and propaganda were equally central to the Cold War experience. Media, education, and culture became battlegrounds where competing narratives were promoted and reinforced. In the United States, fear of internal subversion led to loyalty tests, blacklists, and careers destroyed by accusation rather than evidence. In the Soviet Union, dissent was often labeled treason, and alternative viewpoints were suppressed. These practices were justified as necessary for national security, yet they eroded civil liberties and fostered climates of suspicion on both sides. Crises punctuated this long conflict, revealing how fragile the so-called stability actually was. The Cuban Missile Crisis is often cited as the closest the world came to nuclear war, but it was not an isolated incident. Archival evidence shows multiple near misses, false alarms, misinterpreted signals, and technical failures that nearly triggered catastrophic responses. In several cases, catastrophe was avoided not because systems worked as designed, but because individuals chose not to follow protocol. This reliance on human restraint rather than structural safety raises uncomfortable questions about how managed the Cold War truly was. Economic competition also played a central role. Aid programs like the Marshall Plan are often remembered as generous efforts to rebuild war-torn Europe. While they did contribute to recovery, they also served strategic purposes, tying recipient nations economically and politically to the United States. The Soviet Union pursued its own economic networks, seeking to bind allied states into a parallel system. Trade, loans, and development projects became tools of influence, shaping domestic policies in subtle but lasting ways. Economic pressure could be as coercive as military force, particularly for vulnerable states. As decades passed, the Cold War became normalized. Generations grew up under the shadow of nuclear annihilation, practicing drills and absorbing narratives of perpetual threat. This normalization itself was a form of violence, psychological rather than physical, but no less real. Fear shaped political decisions, justified extraordinary measures, and narrowed the range of acceptable debate. The absence of direct superpower war was achieved, but at the cost of a world constantly on edge. Looking at this broader picture, the idea of the Cold War as a restrained, bloodless conflict becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. Violence was omnipresent, even if it was unevenly distributed. Power was exercised through intermediaries, covert actions, and structural pressures rather than open battlefields between superpowers. The war was cold only at its center; at its edges it burned intensely. As this global system continued to evolve, it left behind deep scars, political, social, and psychological, that outlasted the ideological rivalry itself. To understand whether the Cold War was truly cold, we must continue examining not just the decisions made in Washington and Moscow, but the consequences felt far beyond them, in places where the conflict was anything but distant or abstract. By the late 1960s and 1970s, the Cold War entered a phase that many contemporaries described as stabilization. The concept of détente emerged, marked by arms control treaties, diplomatic summits, and a visible effort by both superpowers to manage their rivalry. Agreements like the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and the Strategic Arms Limitation talks were presented as evidence that reason had finally prevailed over confrontation. Official narratives emphasized dialogue, mutual understanding, and the gradual cooling of tensions. Yet beneath this surface of restraint, the machinery of conflict continued to operate, often in ways that were less visible but no less consequential. Détente did not mean disengagement. Instead, it signaled a shift in how power was exercised. While Washington and Moscow negotiated limits on certain weapon systems, they simultaneously expanded their influence elsewhere. Intelligence operations intensified, proxy conflicts persisted, and military spending continued at extraordinary levels. Declassified memoranda from both sides revealed a shared assumption that cooperation in one arena did not preclude competition in others. Arms control was not a step toward peace so much as a method of managing risk while preserving strategic advantage. This period also exposed the limits of ideological explanations. As the Cold War progressed, alliances became increasingly pragmatic. The United States, once committed to opposing communism everywhere, supported authoritarian regimes so long as they aligned strategically. The Soviet Union, despite its revolutionary rhetoric, maintained relationships based on stability rather than ideological purity. The Sino-Soviet split is a striking example. Two communist states, ostensibly united by ideology, became bitter rivals due to national interests, border disputes, and leadership ambitions. This fracture challenged the idea that the Cold War was simply a binary ideological struggle and suggested instead a complex web of competing power centers. China's role during this period further complicates the notion of a cold conflict. The Korean War had already demonstrated how quickly regional disputes could escalate into international confrontations. Later, China's involvement in Vietnam and its border clashes with the Soviet Union underscored how volatile the global system remained. For countries caught between multiple powers, the Cold War was not a stable equilibrium, but an unpredictable and dangerous environment. Diplomatic cables from non-aligned nations often express frustration at being treated as arenas rather than actors, their internal dynamics shaped by forces far beyond their control. The Middle East became another focal point where Cold War tensions translated into real violence. Conflicts involving Israel and its neighbors were influenced by superpower rivalry, with arms, funding, and diplomatic backing flowing from both sides. While these wars were rooted in regional histories and grievances, Cold War dynamics amplified their scale and intensity. Superpower involvement hardened positions, reduced incentives for compromise, and ensured that local conflicts carried global implications. Again, the absence of direct U.S.-Soviet combat did not prevent devastation on the ground. Even in moments of apparent calm, the threat of escalation loomed. Military exercises, surveillance flights, and naval encounters brought opposing forces into close proximity. Incidents such as accidental airspace violations or naval collisions carried the risk of rapid escalation. Internal military assessments later revealed how thin the margin for error often was. Communication failures, ambiguous signals, and rigid command structures created scenarios in which a single misinterpretation could have triggered catastrophic consequences. The Cold War's coldness depended not on inherent stability, but on continuous vigilance and restraint under extreme pressure. Technological advancement, often celebrated as a triumph of Cold War competition, also intensified the risks. Early warning systems, missile defenses, and automated command structures were designed to provide security, yet they introduced new vulnerabilities. False alarms became more consequential as response times shortened. In several documented cases, warnings of incoming attacks were later discovered to be system errors. That nuclear war did not occur in these moments was not due to flawless technology, but to individuals who hesitated, questioned, or chose caution over protocol. This reliance on human judgment rather than systemic reliability challenges the idea that deterrence alone ensured peace. Meanwhile, the social and economic costs of sustained militarization accumulated. In both superpowers, vast resources were devoted to defense spending, often at the expense of social programs. Entire regions became economically dependent on military industries, creating political incentives to sustain the conflict. Public discourse framed these expenditures as necessary for security, yet internal budget debates reveal concerns about long-term sustainability. The Cold War was not only fought abroad, it reshaped domestic priorities, institutions, and values. Cultural life during this period reflected the pervasive influence of the conflict. Films, literature, and popular media reinforced narratives of existential threat and heroic resistance. These cultural products helped normalize a permanent state of tension, making extraordinary measures seem ordinary. Fear became a background condition of everyday life. Children practiced drills, citizens accepted surveillance, and dissent was often equated with disloyalty. While less visible than battlefield violence, this psychological dimension of the Cold War left lasting effects on societies on both sides of the divide. For countries attempting to remain neutral, the Cold War presented its own challenges. The non-aligned movement sought to carve out space outside the binary framework, emphasizing sovereignty and self-determination. Yet neutrality was difficult to sustain. Economic aid, military assistance, and diplomatic recognition were often conditioned on alignment. Leaders who resisted pressure faced isolation or internal destabilization. Archival records from non-aligned states reveal a constant balancing act, navigating between competing demands while trying to preserve autonomy. As the Cold War entered its later decades, cracks in the system became more visible. Economic stagnation in the Soviet Union, growing public skepticism in the West, and the cumulative impact of prolonged proxy wars began to undermine the foundations of the rivalry. Yet even as rhetoric softened and negotiations expanded, the underlying structures of competition remained intact. Military alliances persisted, intelligence agencies continued their work, and regional conflicts showed little sign of resolution. This phase of the Cold War demonstrated that its defining characteristic was not the absence of violence, but the management of it. Conflict was constrained in certain ways, redirected in others, and embedded into global systems of politics, economics, and culture. The Cold War remained cold only in the narrow sense that the two principal adversaries avoided direct combat. For everyone else, the experience was far more complex and often far more violent. As we continue examining this period, the central question becomes harder to ignore. If peace is defined not only by the absence of direct confrontation between great powers, but by the absence of widespread suffering, instability, and fear, then what does the Cold War truly represent? To answer that, we must look at how it ended and what its conclusion reveals about the nature of the conflict itself. By the 1980s, the Cold War entered what many contemporaries believed was its final and most dangerous phase. The language of restraint remained, but the underlying structure of confrontation intensified once again. Military spending surged, ideological rhetoric hardened, and technological competition accelerated. In the United States, the renewed emphasis on strategic dominance was framed as a response to perceived Soviet expansion and weakness. In the Soviet Union, leadership faced mounting economic strain and political stagnation, yet remained committed to preserving superpower status. Official statements on both sides spoke of peace through strength, but the methods used to achieve that strength carried enormous risk. The arms race during this period revealed how fragile the Cold War balance truly was. New generations of nuclear weapons were developed with greater accuracy and shorter response times, reducing the margin for error even further. Strategic doctrines increasingly emphasized rapid reaction, preemptive capability, and automated command structures. Internal military assessments from both blocs showed deep concern about accidental escalation. The logic of deterrence assumed rational actors with perfect information, yet the systems designed to enforce deterrence were vulnerable to miscalculation, technical failure, and human stress. Stability depended less on certainty than on constant crisis management. At the same time, proxy conflicts did not diminish. Central America, Southern Africa, and the Middle East remained deeply entangled in Cold War dynamics. In Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Guatemala, civil wars were fueled by foreign funding, weapons, and training. Official explanations framed these interventions as necessary to prevent ideological expansion or defend allies, but the human cost was staggering. Civilian populations faced massacres, displacement, and long-term trauma. Truth commissions established years later documented patterns of violence that were well known to foreign backers at the time, raising difficult questions about responsibility and moral distance. Afghanistan became perhaps the most consequential proxy war of the late Cold War. What began as a Soviet intervention to stabilize a friendly government turned into a prolonged conflict that drained resources, undermined legitimacy, and radicalized regional politics. The United States and its allies supported insurgent forces, viewing the conflict as an opportunity to weaken Soviet influence. Official narratives celebrated resistance and strategic success, yet internal analyses acknowledged the risk of long-term instability. The war devastated Afghanistan, leaving behind a fractured society and a legacy of militarization that outlasted the Cold War itself. Here again, the conflict was cold only in diplomatic terms. On the ground, it was relentless and brutal. Even in regions far from active battlefields, the Cold War imposed its costs. Economic sanctions, trade restrictions, and financial pressure became tools of competition. These measures were often justified as nonviolent alternatives to military force, yet their effects could be severe. Shortages, inflation, and declining living standards disproportionately affected ordinary citizens rather than political elites. In both blocs, economic policy was shaped not solely by domestic needs, but by strategic considerations, reinforcing the idea that the Cold War penetrated everyday life in subtle but pervasive ways. The internal pressures generated by this prolonged rivalry began to reshape political systems themselves. In the Soviet Union, efforts to sustain military parity strained an economy already struggling with inefficiency and stagnation. Leadership debates revealed growing awareness that the existing model was unsustainable. Reforms were introduced not to end the Cold War, but to survive it. Ironically, these reforms exposed structural weaknesses that decades of centralized control and ideological rigidity had concealed. The Cold War, intended to preserve power, ultimately contributed to its erosion. In the West, public opinion also shifted. The memory of proxy wars, nuclear scares, and prolonged militarization led to growing skepticism about the costs of confrontation. Anti-nuclear movements, civil rights activism, and demands for transparency challenged official narratives of necessity and inevitability. Governments continued to speak in terms of security and deterrence, but the gap between rhetoric and lived experience widened. The Cold War was no longer perceived solely as a distant strategic chess match. Its consequences were increasingly visible at home. One of the most revealing aspects of this period is how close the Cold War came to ending, not with negotiation, but with exhaustion. Diplomatic breakthroughs of the late 1880s are often remembered as triumphs of leadership and vision. While individual choices mattered, they occurred within a context shaped by decades of pressure, cost, and accumulated risk. Declassified meeting notes show that fear of unintended catastrophe played a significant role in shifting priorities. The recognition that systems designed to prevent war might instead trigger it forced a reevaluation of long-standing assumptions. As tensions eased and barriers fell, the language used to describe the Cold War began to change. It was increasingly framed as a victory of one system over another, a peaceful conclusion to a dangerous rivalry. This framing risks obscuring the full scope of what occurred. The Cold War did not end because violence was avoided, but because its cumulative effects became unsustainable. For many regions, the end of superpower rivalry did not bring immediate peace. Conflicts fueled by Cold War dynamics continued, sometimes intensifying as external controls disappeared. Weapons remained, grievances persisted, and institutions weakened by decades of intervention struggled to adapt. The Cold War's conclusion marked the end of a global framework, but not the end of the instability it had created. This lingering aftermath challenges the notion that the conflict was neatly contained or resolved. Looking back, the final years of the Cold War reveal its true character more clearly than its beginning. It was a system built on restraint and risk, cooperation and confrontation, stability and violence. It relied on careful management, constant vigilance, and a willingness to accept suffering at the margins in exchange for avoiding catastrophe at the center. The Cold War remained cold only so long as its costs were borne elsewhere. As we approach the end of this story, the central question remains unresolved. If a conflict avoids direct battle between its strongest participants but generates widespread violence, fear, and instability across the world, how should it be defined? To answer that, we must look not only at how the Cold War ended, but at how it is remembered and what that memory leaves out. By the late 1880s, the Cold War appeared to be winding down, but even its ending raises the same question that defines the entire conflict. Was it ever truly cold, or had it simply changed forms? Mikhail Gorbachev's rise to power in the Soviet Union brought reforms that fundamentally altered the global balance. Policies like glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, were not acts of ideological surrender, but desperate attempts to save a system strained by decades of military spending, economic inefficiency, and political repression. The Cold War had not frozen history, it had exhausted it. For decades, the Soviet economy had prioritized tanks over tractors, missiles over consumer goods. Maintaining nuclear parity with the United States drained resources that could have improved living standards. The United States, though economically stronger, also paid a heavy price. Trillions were spent on defense, proxy wars, intelligence agencies, and technological competition. The Cold War shaped national budgets, education systems, and scientific research, often subordinating human needs to strategic calculations. As tensions eased, long-suppressed conflicts resurfaced. Eastern Europe, held together by Soviet power rather than popular consent, began to unravel. Poland's solidarity movement, Hungary's reforms, and East Germany's internal collapse all pointed to the same truth. The Cold War had never been cold for the people living under its front lines. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, it was not the end of a peaceful standoff, it was the visible collapse of a decades-long coercive order maintained through fear. The dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 is often portrayed as a quiet ending, but this interpretation ignores the human cost. Economic shock therapy led to mass unemployment, collapsing life expectancy, and social dislocation across the former Soviet states. Ethnic conflicts erupted in places like the Caucasus and Central Asia. Yugoslavia descended into brutal wars in the 1990s, fueled by unresolved Cold War-era divisions and power vacuums. The Cold War did not end cleanly, it fractured into new violent forms. Globally, many nations that had served as Cold War battlegrounds were left destabilized. Afghanistan, armed and radicalized during the Soviet-US proxy war, became a breeding ground for militant movements. Central America struggled with the legacy of civil wars and authoritarian regimes supported in the name of anti-communism. Africa faced lingering conflicts rooted in Cold War interventions. These regions paid the price long after the superpowers declared victory or defeat. Even the idea of victory itself is misleading. The United States emerged as the sole superpower, but the end of the Cold War did not bring universal peace. Instead, it reshaped global power dynamics. NATO expanded eastward, triggering new tensions with Russia. Former Cold War technologies, surveillance systems, cyber capabilities, advanced weapons did not disappear, they evolved. The Cold War mindset survived, embedded in institutions and strategic thinking. Perhaps the most revealing evidence that the Cold War was never truly cold lies in its psychological legacy. Generations grew up under the shadow of nuclear annihilation. School children practiced duck-and-cover drills. Popular culture reflected existential dread, from dystopian novels to apocalyptic films. Trust between nations eroded, replaced by suspicion and secrecy. Intelligence agencies gained unprecedented power, often operating beyond democratic oversight. This climate of fear reshaped political norms and justified extraordinary measures in the name of security. The Cold War also distorted moral reasoning. Atrocities were excused if committed by allies. Dictators were tolerated or supported if they aligned with the right ideology. Democratic values were often secondary to strategic advantage. This moral flexibility left lasting scars, contributing to cynicism about international politics and human rights that persist today. So, was the Cold War really cold? If measured only by the absence of direct combat between the United States and the Soviet Union, perhaps, but this definition is dangerously narrow. The Cold War was hot in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Angola, and countless other places. It was hot in secret prisons, in coups and assassinations, in famines worsened by sanctions and blockades. It was hot in the lives of civilians who never chose sides but were forced to endure the consequences. More accurately, the Cold War was a global war fought indirectly, strategically, and often invisibly. It replaced traditional battlefields with ideological fronts, economic pressure, and proxy armies. Its weapons included propaganda, financial aid, espionage, and the constant threat of nuclear destruction. The absence of a single decisive battle does not make it peaceful, it makes it pervasive. Understanding the Cold War as anything less than a real war risks repeating its mistakes. When rivalry is framed as inevitable, when security is prioritized over humanity, and when ideological purity justifies violence, the conditions for another Cold War emerge. Today's world, marked by renewed great power competition, proxy conflicts, and technological arms races, echoes many Cold War patterns. The lesson of the Cold War is not that restraint prevented catastrophe, but that catastrophe was narrowly avoided, often by chance, individual judgment, or sheer luck. The world survived not because the Cold War was cold, but because it was constantly on the brink of becoming unbearably hot. In the end, the Cold War was not a frozen conflict. It was a slow-burning global struggle whose flames touched nearly every corner of the world. Its legacy reminds us that wars do not need formal declarations or massive invasions to be real. Sometimes the most dangerous wars are the ones that never officially begin, but never truly end.